Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. 23 years on the force, and I thought I'd seen everything. Most detectives my age were counting down to retirement, coaching Little League, maybe picking up golf. Not me. I'd transferred to the cold case unit in early 2018. Figured I'd spend my last years giving families closure instead of chasing down drug dealers in alleyways. The precinct was old, built in 1952, all brick and narrow hallways that echoed when you walked alone at night. My office sat right next to the evidence room in the basement, a windowless corner that most officers avoided. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly down there, creating this low-frequency buzz that got under your skin after a few hours. I actually liked the isolation, though. Just me, my coffee that always went cold too fast, and boxes full of forgotten lives waiting for someone to remember them. The evidence room itself was a beast of a place, maybe 40 feet by 60, packed floor to ceiling with metal shelving units that creaked whenever the building settled. Each shelf held cardboard boxes labeled with case numbers, dates, victim names written in fading black marker. The smell hit you first when you walked in. Old paper, dust, and something else I could never quite identify, like pennies left in water too long. I had my own system for organizing everything. Spent my first month creating a detailed inventory that cross-referenced cases by date, location, and victim demographics. Nobody else really came down there except Officer Kowalski, who'd grab evidence for court appearances maybe once a month. The room had one entrance, a heavy steel door that required a key card and a 6-digit code that changed every Monday. Only 5 people had access: me, the chief, 2 senior detectives upstairs, and the evidence technician who worked days. It started on a Wednesday in October. I'd been working a triple homicide from 1987, spreading crime scene photos across my desk when I needed to check the ballistics report. Grabbed my keys, punched in the code, heard that familiar click of the lock disengaging. But when I flipped on the lights and walked to Section C where I kept all the 87 cases, the boxes were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just shifted. The Montgomery case that should have been third from the left was now on the far right. The Riverside murders had moved up a shelf. Small changes, but after organizing that room down to the last manila folder, I noticed immediately. I spent an hour putting everything back, figured maybe the night janitor had bumped into the shelves while mopping. Made a mental note to check the access log later, then got back to my triple homicide. Friday morning, same thing. Only this time it wasn't just random shifting. Every single box from the missing persons section had been pulled forward about 6 inches, like someone had been reading the labels. The weird part? They were all from the same time period, 1983 to 1989. 7 years of vanished people, their boxes now jutting out from the shelves like crooked teeth. I checked the digital access log on my computer immediately. Last entry, Detective Nathan Caldwell, that's me. Wednesday, 3:47 p.m. Before that, Evidence Tech Roger Simmons, the previous Monday at noon. Nobody had been in that room for 2 days except me. I walked each aisle slowly, checking for disturbed dust patterns, maybe a window I'd missed, any sign of entry. Nothing. The dust on top of the boxes was thick and undisturbed, except where fingers had clearly grabbed them to pull them forward. I started bringing the files back to my office. Figured I'd work through them there instead of constantly reorganizing the evidence room. The first box I opened belonged to a woman named Diana Morse, vanished from a grocery store parking lot in 1985. Her daughter, only 6 at the time, had been waiting in the car. The little girl told police her mom went back to get milk they'd forgotten, never returned. Security cameras weren't common back then. No witnesses, just an empty car with a confused child, and groceries melting in the trunk. The second box, Frank Giovetti, construction worker, disappeared after his shift in 1986. His truck was found 2 miles from the job site, keys still in the ignition, his untouched lunch on the passenger seat. As I read through these files, I noticed something strange. Each person had reported seeing the same thing in the days before they vanished. A tall figure in dark clothing, standing perfectly still in random places. Diana's husband mentioned it in his statement. She'd complained about someone standing across from their house 3 nights in a row, never moving, just watching. The following Monday hit different. I'd locked everything up Friday afternoon, even took photos of the room with my phone to document the shelf positions. Came in early, around 6 a.m. Nobody else in the building except the desk sergeant upstairs. The evidence room door was still locked, code unchanged, no signs of tampering. But when I opened it and hit the lights, my chest tightened. Every single missing persons box from the 1980s, all 43 of them, had been removed from their shelves and stacked in the center of the room. They formed a perfect pyramid, each box aligned precisely with the ones below it. The top box had been opened, its contents spread across the floor in a semicircle. Photos, witness statements, evidence bags, all arranged like someone was trying to tell a story. In the very center sat a single photograph I'd never seen before, a blurry image of that tall figure in dark clothing, standing in what looked like our evidence room, dated 1989. I called the chief immediately, told him to come down alone. While waiting, I studied that photograph under the fluorescent lights. The figure stood near the back wall between shelves that looked identical to ours, but the boxes were different. Older labels, different handwriting. You couldn't make out any features, just the shape of someone impossibly thin, maybe 7 feet tall, arms hanging too long at their sides. Chief Morrison arrived within 20 minutes, took one look at the scene, and ordered the security footage pulled immediately. We went upstairs to the security office, rewound the weekend's recordings. Saturday, 2:17 a.m. The evidence room sat empty and dark. Then at 2:18 a.m., the lights flickered on by themselves. The camera showed the room clearly, every shelf visible, and then we saw it. The drawers of the filing cabinets along the wall started sliding open one by one, papers lifting out and floating through the air like leaves in a wind that didn't exist. The boxes began moving at 2:23 a.m. They slid off the shelves slowly at first, almost carefully, drifting toward the center of the room. No hands touching them, no strings or wires visible, just boxes moving through empty space with deliberate purpose. The chief grabbed my shoulder hard enough to hurt, neither of us saying anything as we watched them stack themselves into that perfect pyramid. The worst part came at 2:41 a.m. when the top box opened itself. The contents didn't just spill out. They arranged themselves piece by piece on the floor, each document and photo sliding into position like someone was controlling them. Then the lights went out. When they came back on 3 seconds later, that new photograph was there in the center, just materialized out of nothing. We watched the timestamp jump to 2:42 a.m. Then the lights turned off again, and everything stayed dark until I'd arrived that morning. Chief Morrison made the call to bring in a forensics team, but kept it quiet, only told them we had a potential break-in with unusual circumstances. While they dusted for prints and photographed everything, I started connecting dots between the missing persons cases. Every victim had lived within a 3-mile radius of the precinct. All had visited this building in the weeks before they vanished. Diana Morse had reported a stolen purse. Frank Giovetti had been a witness in an assault case. I pulled visitor logs from the 1980s, cross-referencing names with the missing persons files. That's when I found him. Robert Vance, evidence technician from 1983 to 1989. He'd handled every single one of these cases before disappearing himself in December of '89. No body ever found, no explanation, just stopped showing up one day. His employee photo showed a tall, thin man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. I went back down to the evidence room alone that afternoon while forensics worked upstairs. Needed to find Vance's personnel file, see if there was more to his story. The room felt colder than usual, that fluorescent buzz louder, almost like whispers if you didn't listen too carefully. Found his file in a dusty cabinet near the back wall, right where that figure had stood in the photograph. Inside, along with standard employment documents, was a handwritten note I'd never seen before. They never leave. They're still here, in the spaces between the evidence, waiting in the dust and silence. I tried to help them go, but they won't let me leave either. If you're reading this, you've seen them moving things. They're trying to show you what happened. Look for the maintenance tunnel. RV. My mouth went dry reading those words. There was no maintenance tunnel on any blueprint I'd seen, but when I moved the cabinet aside, scraping against 40 years of dust and grime, I found it. A small metal door, painted the same industrial beige as the walls, with a lock that had been broken from the inside. The tunnel was narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, concrete walls sweating with moisture that smelled like copper and mold. I had to duck to fit through, my flashlight beam catching on thick spider webs that hadn't been disturbed in decades. 20 feet in, the tunnel opened into a small room, maybe 10 by 10 feet, and there they were. All 43 missing persons from the 1980s, their bodies preserved in some impossible way, sitting against the walls like they were sleeping. No decay, no smell of death, just people frozen in time wearing the same clothes they'd disappeared in. Diana Morse still had her grocery list in her hand. Frank Giovetti's hard hat rested on his lap. In the center of them all sat Robert Vance, his tall frame folded into itself, those hollow eyes now closed. But on the wall behind him, written in what looked like rust or dried blood, were hundreds of names and dates going back to the 1950s. The last entry, dated December 1989, simply read, "I couldn't free them. They keep collecting more. The building feeds on the lost. Close the room, seal it forever." I backed out of that tunnel faster than I'd ever moved in my life, called the chief, told him to evacuate the building immediately. Within an hour, we had every available unit there. The medical examiner, state police, even the FBI got involved. But when we went back down with the full team, the tunnel was empty. Not a single body, no writing on the walls, just an empty concrete room with 40 years of dust undisturbed. The only thing left was a single photograph on the floor, the same one that had appeared in the evidence room that morning, but now I could see it clearly. It wasn't from 1989. The timestamp in the corner showed today's date, 3 hours in the future. And in the image, that tall figure in dark clothing wasn't standing in the evidence room. It was standing right behind me. We sealed the evidence room that day, moved all the files to a new facility across town. But sometimes officers at the old precinct still report boxes moving in the basement, even though that room stays locked. And every October since then, I get a package at my home with no return address. Always a photograph of that empty tunnel, and written on the back, "Still waiting, still collecting." I'm retired now, living 3 states away, but I know one day I'll have to go back. The lost don't rest, and neither do those who find them. "7 years on the force, and you develop a sixth sense about which calls are going to stick with you. It was a Wednesday night in early November, around 2:47 a.m., according to my dash cam footage that I had to review later for the report. I was patrolling the east side of town, the quiet residential area where most of our calls were noise complaints or the occasional drunk and disorderly. My partner Craig had called in sick that shift, so I was riding solo, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos my wife had filled before I left for work. The radio crackled to life just as I was turning onto Birch Avenue. Dispatch asking for a unit to respond to a welfare check at the Riverside Garden Apartments, Building C, Apartment 312. Multiple neighbors had called about shouting and what sounded like furniture being thrown around, then sudden silence. The kind of silence that makes people nervous enough to actually pick up the phone and call 911. I remember pulling into that parking lot and noticing how many lights were on for that time of night. Not just in 312, but in the surrounding apartments too. People were awake, probably pressed against their doors, listening. The building had that typical worn-down look of subsidized housing, peeling paint on the railings, a broken light flickering in the stairwell. As I climbed to the 3rd floor, I could hear whispers behind doors. Someone's TV turned down low. A baby crying somewhere below. The hallway smelled like old carpet and someone's late dinner. Curry, maybe. Apartment 312 was at the end of the hall, and even from 20 feet away I could see the door was slightly ajar, just a crack, maybe 2 inches. No light coming from inside, just darkness bleeding into the dim hallway. I announced myself loudly. Police department, welfare check, and waited. Nothing, not even the sound of breathing. That's when I noticed the first drop of blood on the door frame, fresh enough that it was still glistening under the hallway's fluorescent light. I pushed the door open with my flashlight, keeping my other hand on my service weapon. The living room was destroyed, coffee table flipped over, glass from picture frames scattered across the carpet, a lamp lying sideways still plugged in but the bulb shattered. The walls had dents, fist-sized holes near the kitchen entrance. But what made me draw my weapon was the blood trail leading from the overturned couch toward the bedroom. Not drops anymore, but smears, like someone had been dragged or crawled. The metallic smell hit me then, that copper penny taste that gets in the back of your throat. I called for backup immediately, whispering into my radio while following the trail with my flashlight beam. The apartment was small, maybe 700 square feet, and every shadow could have been hiding someone. I heard it then, a wet, ragged breathing coming from the bedroom. Shallow, struggling, but definitely human. She was propped against the dresser when I found her, and for a second I thought she was already gone. Her shirt, which might have been white or yellow originally, was soaked through with blood from at least 3 wounds I could see immediately. Her eyes were half closed, fluttering, and her lips were moving but no sound was coming out. I dropped to my knees beside her, pressing my radio mic. I need EMS at Riverside Gardens now, Building C, Apartment 312. Female victim with multiple stab wounds, conscious but barely responsive. Her hand moved slightly, fingers twitching toward the hallway behind me, toward the bathroom. That's when I realized we weren't alone in the apartment. The bathroom door was closed, but I could see light underneath it, just a sliver, and there was blood on the doorknob. Fresh blood, still running down in a thin line. My training kicked in. Secure the victim, clear the apartment, wait for backup. But backup was at least 4 minutes out, and this woman was dying in front of me. I positioned myself between her and the bathroom door, weapon drawn, and called out, "Police! Anyone in the bathroom, come out slowly with your hands visible." The silence stretched for maybe 3 seconds before I heard movement, the sound of someone shifting weight on the tile floor, the medicine cabinet mirror rattling slightly. Then a voice, male, strangely calm. "Officer, I'm coming out. Don't shoot." The door opened slowly, and I'll never forget what I saw. A man, maybe 35, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans, both covered in blood spatter. His hands were raised, but in his right hand he was still holding the knife, a kitchen knife with a black handle, probably 8 inches long, blood running down onto his wrist. His face was completely blank, no emotion, like he was sleepwalking. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring past me at the woman on the floor, and there was this weird little half smile on his face, like he was remembering something pleasant. "Drop the knife. Drop it now." I kept my weapon trained on his center mass, but he just stood there in the doorway, swaying slightly. The woman behind me made a gurgling sound, and I could hear her trying to push herself further against the dresser, trying to get away from him even though she could barely move. He took 1 step forward, still holding the knife, and said, "She wasn't supposed to be here tonight. She changed her schedule. I waited 3 weeks to catch her alone, and she changed her schedule." His voice was so matter-of-fact, like he was explaining why he was late for dinner. I could hear sirens in the distance, maybe 2 minutes out, but 2 minutes is an eternity when you're standing between a dying woman and her attacker. He took another step, and I could see his grip tightening on the knife handle, his knuckles going white. "You need to leave," he told me, still in that eerily calm voice. "This is between me and Ashley. We have unfinished business." Ashley. Now she had a name, and suddenly I could hear her behind me, whispering something over and over. It took me a second to make it out. "Please, please, please." Just that one word on repeat, getting weaker each time. The man, I'd later learn his name was Bradley Hutchinson, her ex-boyfriend of 2 years, started telling me their story like we were having coffee. "We were supposed to get married," he said, taking another small step forward. "I bought the ring. It's in my car downstairs. 2 carats, princess cut, exactly what she wanted. But she decided she wanted to go back to school instead, nursing school. Said she needed to find herself." He laughed then, this bitter, hollow sound that made my finger move to the trigger. Find herself. She found someone else is what she did. Some guy from her anatomy class. I saw the text messages. The knife in his hand was shaking now, and I could see tears starting to run down his face, mixing with the blood spatter on his cheeks. The sirens were getting louder, maybe 30 seconds out now, and I knew I had to keep him talking, keep him focused on me instead of Ashley. "Bradley," I said, using the de-escalation training they drill into us, "I understand you're hurt, but Ashley needs medical help right now. Put the knife down and we can talk about this." He tilted his head at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "You don't understand," he said. "I gave up everything for her, my job in Seattle, my friends, my family. I moved here to this garbage town because she wanted to be near her sick mother. And what does she do? She throws me out like trash. Changes the locks, gets a restraining order because I sent her flowers." He was crying harder now, but his grip on the knife never loosened. "Flowers. I sent her flowers and she called the police." Behind me, Ashley had gone quiet, and I couldn't turn around to check on her without taking my eyes off Bradley. The blood pool I could see in my peripheral vision was growing larger, spreading across the beige carpet toward my boots. That's when he made his move. It wasn't dramatic like in the movies. He just suddenly rushed forward, knife raised, that blank expression back on his face. Training took over completely. 2 shots, center mass, just like they teach you at the academy. The sound was deafening in that small bedroom, and my ears rang for hours afterward. Bradley dropped instantly, the knife clattering across the floor and sliding under the bed. He fell forward, landing maybe 3 feet from where Ashley was slumped against the dresser. His body twitched once, twice, then went still. The whole thing took maybe 2 seconds, but I can still replay it in slow motion whenever I close my eyes. I kicked the knife further away and checked his pulse. Nothing. Then I turned to Ashley, dropping to my knees beside her, pressing my hands against the worst of her wounds. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and her breathing was so shallow I could barely see her chest moving. "Stay with me, Ashley. Help's here. You're going to be okay." I kept talking to her, saying anything I could think of, while pressing down on her wounds with towels I grabbed from the bathroom. The next few minutes were chaos. Paramedics burst in, pushing me aside to work on Ashley. More officers arrived, securing the scene, asking me questions I could barely process. Someone took my weapon for the investigation, standard procedure for an officer-involved shooting. They got Ashley on a stretcher, IV lines going, oxygen mask over her face, and rushed her out. I heard one of the paramedics say she'd lost at least 2 pints of blood, maybe more. The detective who showed up, a guy named Brennan who I'd worked with before, walked me through what happened while the scene was still fresh. He had me show him exactly where I was standing, where Bradley came from, where the knife ended up. Crime scene techs were taking photos of everything, the blood patterns, the destroyed living room, Bradley's body still on the bedroom floor. They found his car in the parking lot with the engagement ring he'd mentioned, still in its velvet box on the passenger seat, along with rope, zip ties, and a tarp in the trunk. He'd come prepared for something worse than what he'd already done. I spent the rest of that night and most of the next day at the station, writing reports, talking to internal affairs, going over every second of those 8 minutes from when I entered the apartment to when I pulled the trigger. They put me on administrative leave, which is standard. But those 3 weeks waiting to be cleared to return to duty were some of the hardest of my life. I kept replaying everything, wondering if I could have talked him down, if I should have waited for backup, if there was any other way it could have ended. My wife would find me sitting in our kitchen at 3 a.m., staring at nothing, and she'd make me tea and sit with me until the sun came up. The department made me see a counselor, Dr. Reeves, who told me what I did saved Ashley's life. The medical examiner's report said Bradley had methamphetamine in his system, which explained the 3 weeks of planning, the paranoid delusions about Ashley's text messages, the complete disconnect from reality. But knowing the why didn't make the what any easier to live with. Ashley survived. That's the part I hold on to when the memories get too heavy. She spent 2 weeks in the ICU, had 4 surgeries to repair the damage to her liver and intestines, and months of physical therapy after that. I visited her once about 6 months later, after she reached out through the department saying she wanted to thank me. We met at a coffee shop downtown, and she looked so different from that night. Healthy, strong, alive. She told me she'd finished nursing school, that she was working at the children's hospital now, that she'd moved to a new apartment on the other side of town. She showed me pictures of her new dog, a golden retriever named Buddy, who she said helped her feel safe at night. We didn't talk much about what happened, we didn't need to. But before she left, she grabbed my hand and said, "You gave me the chance to have this life. Every good day I have exists because you were there that night." I still carry those words with me, especially on the bad nights when I can still smell the blood, still hear Bradley's voice talking about wedding rings while holding that knife. The shooting was ruled justified, and I went back to patrol after my leave ended. But I'm different now. Every domestic call, every welfare check. I remember that apartment, that night, and how quickly everything can go wrong. I keep Ashley's thank you card in my locker at the station, a reminder that sometimes, even in the worst moments, we can make a difference. Sometimes, we get there in time. I spent 14 years working emergency dispatch in a mid-sized city in Oregon, and nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that Thursday night in late October 2022. The leaves had just started falling heavy that week, and we were dealing with the usual uptick in minor accidents from wet roads. I was pulling a double shift because Janet had called in sick with the flu, and honestly, I didn't mind the overtime. My daughter Chloe had just started college, and every extra dollar helped. The dispatch center was quieter than usual that night, just me, my supervisor Tom, and 2 other dispatchers handling the west side of the city. Around 11:47 p.m., everything changed when a call came through from a number that shouldn't have existed. The screen lit up with an incoming 911 call, but the origin point made no sense. It showed as coming from the old payphone outside the Riverside Police Station on Oak Street, the one that had been shut down in 1987 after they moved operations to the new building downtown. I knew that payphone well because my uncle used to work at that station before it closed. The phone company had disconnected that line 35 years ago, ripped out all the wiring when they demolished half the building for a parking lot. Yet there it was on my screen, blinking red like any other emergency call. I figured it had to be some kind of system glitch, maybe crossed wires from the construction they were doing on the east side. I put on my headset and answered with the standard greeting, expecting dead air or maybe some drunk kid who'd somehow rigged an old phone to mess with us. The voice that came through was crystal clear, no static, no background noise, just a calm, professional tone that sent ice through my veins. "Dispatch, this is Officer Thompson, badge number 4782. Scene is secured at Oak and 3rd. No backup required. Repeat, scene secured." The voice had that clipped formal cadence that older officers used back in the day, before everything became more casual. But what really got me was the badge number. We hadn't used 4-digit badge numbers since 1995 when the department switched to a 6-digit system. I pulled up our database while the voice kept talking, describing the scene in brief, efficient sentences. My fingers fumbled on the keyboard as I searched for Officer Thompson, badge 4782. When the record came up, I had to read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't seeing things. Officer James Thompson, badge 4782, had died in the line of duty on October 28, 1983. Shot during a routine traffic stop at the intersection of Oak and 3rd. The exact location he'd just reported as secured. The database showed his photo, A young guy with thick sideburns and that serious expression all cops had in their official pictures back then. According to the file, he'd bled out before backup arrived. His final radio transmission cut short mid-sentence. I sat there staring at the screen while the voice on my headset continued its report, calm and methodical, like nothing was wrong. Tom must have noticed something was up because he rolled his chair over to my station, mouthing, "What's wrong?" I hit the speaker button so he could hear, and watched his face go pale as Officer Thompson's voice filled the space between us. Before either of us could react, the line went dead. Not the normal click of someone hanging up, just sudden, complete silence. Tom grabbed the desk to steady himself and told me to log it as a prank call, but we both knew that was impossible. Our system tracks everything, records everything, and you can't fake a call origin like that. The coordinates were precise, showing the exact location of that old payphone down to the GPS decimal points. While Tom went to check with IT about possible system breaches, I started digging through our archives. What I found made everything worse. In the past 3 months, there had been 17 similar calls from deactivated numbers around the city, all logged as technical errors by different dispatchers who probably didn't want to sound crazy. Each call followed the same pattern, an officer reporting a scene secured, always at the location where they had died. I was still processing this when the board lit up again at 12:23 a.m. Same impossible number, same defunct payphone. This time I recorded everything on my personal phone while answering the call. A different voice came through, younger, with a slight Boston accent. "Dispatch, Officer Ramirez here, badge 5591. We've got the situation contained at Elmwood Park. Suspect in custody, no injuries reported." I didn't need to check the database this time. I remembered the Ramirez case from training. Miguel Ramirez, killed in 1991 during a drug bust gone wrong at Elmwood Park. Shot 6 times in the chest, managed to cuff the suspect before dying. They used his story to teach us about officer dedication. But here he was, reporting from beyond whatever divide separates the living from the dead, his voice steady and professional, following protocol like any good cop would. Tom came back from IT looking shaken. They'd run every diagnostic possible. No breaches, no spoofing, no technical explanation for how these calls were coming through. The payphone's number had been officially retired and recycled twice since 1987. It currently belonged to a dentist's office in Phoenix. Yet our system showed the calls originating from the exact physical location of that old phone booth, which now sat in the middle of an empty lot covered in broken glass and dead weeds. While Tom made calls to wake up the chief, I noticed something else in the pattern. Every officer who called in had died during the last week of October, different years spanning 4 decades. Thompson on October 28th, Ramirez on October 26th, and all the others within that same window. I pulled up a calendar and felt my throat tighten. We were right in the middle of that week. The third call came at 1:15 a.m., and this time 3 of us were listening. The voice belonged to Officer Dolores Washington, badge 6234, who died in 1999 during a domestic violence call. She reported the scene exactly as it had been found after her death. Husband subdued, wife and children safe, officer down in the kitchen. Her voice had this warm quality, like she was smiling while she talked, completely at odds with the fact that she'd been stabbed 14 times with a kitchen knife. After she finished her report and the line went dead, Tom made a decision that probably saved our sanity. He called in everyone, the chief, 2 sergeants, even brought in Father Angelo from St. Mary's, though nobody said out loud why we might need a priest. By 2 a.m., our dispatch center looked like a command post, with 12 people crowded around my station, waiting for the next call. At 2:47 a.m., we got something different. The call came through, same impossible number, but this time there was static, harsh, and grating. Through the interference, we heard multiple voices, overlapping like a badly tuned radio picking up several stations at once. I counted at least 6 distinct officers, all giving reports simultaneously. Scene secured, echoed over and over, a ghostly chorus of the dead doing their duty. One voice rose above the others, clearer and more insistent. Officer Patricia Novak, badge 7891, killed in 2003, but she wasn't reporting her own death scene. Instead, she was giving an address, 482 Sycamore Drive, present day, tomorrow's date. She repeated it 3 times before the cacophony swallowed her voice again. The chief immediately sent 2 units to check that address. It was a modest 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood, nothing special except for one detail that made everyone in the room hold their breath. It was Officer Carl Brennan's home, and Carl was currently on patrol, scheduled to drive past Oak and 3rd in exactly 1 hour as part of his regular route. The chief tried to reach Carl on his radio, but got only static. His patrol car's GPS showed him responding to a domestic disturbance call at 481 Sycamore, the house next door to the address Novak had given us. We watched his unit's movement on the tracking screen, that little blue dot moving through the empty streets while every one of us knew something was about to go terribly wrong. Tom suggested we were overthinking coincidences, that stress was making us paranoid, but his voice shook when he said it. The priest, Father Angelo, had been quietly praying in the corner, his rosary beads clicking in a rhythm that somehow made everything feel more real, more immediate. At 3:33 a.m., Carl's panic button activated. His GPS showed him at the intersection of Oak and 3rd, exactly where Thompson had died 39 years before. Every available unit screamed toward Oak and 3rd while I tried to raise Carl on the radio. Nothing but static. Then suddenly his voice burst through, breathless and terrified. "Shots fired. Officer down. No, wait. I'm okay. Suspect fled on foot heading north on Oak." The relief in the room was palpable until we realized Carl wasn't making sense. He kept reporting an officer down, then correcting himself, saying he was fine, then screaming about seeing someone who couldn't be there. When backup arrived 4 minutes later, they found Carl standing in the middle of the intersection, his weapon drawn, pointing at nothing. His dashcam footage would later show what we couldn't understand in that moment. A figure in an old police uniform standing in front of Carl's vehicle, taking bullets meant for him. The figure looked exactly like James Thompson, down to the thick sideburns and badge 4782, absorbing 3 shots from a suspect who'd been hiding in the abandoned station, waiting to ambush any cop who came through that intersection. Carl survived because dead officers had broken through whatever barrier separates their world from ours, just long enough to save one of their own. The suspect, a man named Harold Vicks who'd been planning this for months after his brother died in a police chase, was caught 6 blocks away. In his apartment, they found detailed plans targeting officers on specific routes, dates, times. He'd studied patrol patterns for over a year. After that night, the calls stopped coming. The old payphone number went silent. But I know they're still out there, watching, protecting, doing their duty even after death. I quit dispatch 3 months later, not because I was scared, but because I finally understood something. Those officers weren't calling to frighten us. They were still on the job, still protecting and serving, just from a different kind of beat. Every October I leave flowers at that old payphone location, and sometimes when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear it ringing. Most people in Millbrook knew me as the guy who ran the hardware store on Chestnut Road for 20 years. It was January of last year when everything I thought I knew about our quiet town got turned upside down. My wife Jennifer and I had just finished dinner when Detective Lawson knocked on our door around 8 in the evening. I'd sold him lumber for his deck the previous summer, so seeing him at my doorstep in his official capacity made my chest tighten. He had that careful expression cops wear when they're about to deliver news that'll change your life forever. Jennifer grabbed my arm as we invited him in, both of us thinking something had happened to our son Kyle, who was away at college. But what Detective Lawson told us that night was somehow worse than anything we could have imagined. The detective sat on our worn leather couch, pulling out a small notepad while refusing Jennifer's offer of coffee. He explained that they'd done a welfare check on Gerald Whitmore earlier that day, the old man who'd worked at Riverside Memorial Funeral Home for 37 years before retiring 5 years back. Neighbors hadn't seen him for 2 weeks. Mail was piling up, and there was a smell coming from his property. They found Gerald alive but suffering from severe dementia, living in squalor. But that wasn't why Detective Lawson was sitting in my living room. When they searched Gerald's garage, they discovered something that made even the veteran officers sick to their stomachs. Plastic bins, dozens of them, stacked floor to ceiling, each one meticulously labeled with dates going back decades. Inside those bins were jewelry, glasses, dental work, and human bones, all taken from bodies that had passed through Riverside Memorial. Detective Lawson cleared his throat and looked directly at me, his gray eyes heavy with responsibility. My mother had passed through Riverside Memorial 8 years ago, a heart attack that took her suddenly on a Thursday afternoon while she was gardening. The date on one of Gerald's bins matched the week of her funeral. They'd found her wedding ring, the thin gold band with 3 small diamonds that my father had saved 6 months to buy back in 1962. But that wasn't all. There was a small velvet pouch containing 4 of her teeth and a section of her sternum, carefully wrapped in funeral home stationery. The detective said Gerald had kept detailed notes about each collection, as he called them, written in cramped handwriting on index cards. My mother's card described her as elegant widow, beautiful bone structure, kept the sternum for its unusual smoothness. Jennifer's fingernails dug into my forearm as the detective continued explaining that my mother wasn't the only one from our family. They'd found items belonging to my Uncle Howard, who died in 2015, and Jennifer's grandmother Rose, who'd passed in 2017. The garage contained remains and belongings from over 300 people, all processed through Riverside Memorial during Gerald's tenure. Some bins held infant hospital bracelets. Others contained war medals that should have been buried with veterans. Gerald had apparently developed this obsession early in his career, starting with small items like buttons or locks of hair, gradually escalating to removing bones during the embalming process. He would carefully extract pieces when alone in the preparation room, replacing the missing parts with cotton padding and mortician's wax so no one would notice during viewings. The most disturbing part was how methodical he'd been. Each bin included photos he'd taken of the deceased during preparation, like some twisted scrapbook of his secret violation. The detective asked if we wanted to see the recovered items, but I couldn't form words. My mind kept circling back to my mother's funeral, how we'd stood there believing she was whole, at peace, wearing the dress she'd picked out years before. I remembered touching her hand one last time, cold and waxy, never knowing that beneath her burial clothes, parts of her were already missing. Gerald had been there that day, his face appropriately solemn, even helping my elderly aunt to her seat. He'd offered his condolences with a firm handshake and told me my mother looked beautiful, that he'd taken extra care with her preparation. Those words now felt like broken glass in my memory. Jennifer started crying silently beside me, and I knew she was thinking about her grandmother's funeral, how we'd placed family photos in the casket, never imagining that someone had already taken their own sick souvenirs. Detective Lawson gave us a moment before explaining what would happen next. The state was launching a full investigation, and every family affected would be contacted over the coming weeks. They'd seized all of Gerald's records, including a leather journal where he'd written about his compulsion in disturbing detail. He described feeling a connection to the deceased, believing he was preserving their essence by keeping pieces of them. The journal entries went back 40 years, describing how he'd started after his own mother's death, unable to let her go completely. He'd kept her entire left hand, which they found preserved in a special refrigerated container in his basement, still wearing her ruby engagement ring. The detective said Gerald's dementia had progressed to where he couldn't understand why he was being removed from his home, kept asking about his guests and when they'd be returning for dinner. After Detective Lawson left, Jennifer and I sat in stunned silence until nearly midnight. Then something occurred to me that made me rush to our bedroom closet. I pulled out the photo album from my mother's funeral, flipping through until I found the picture of her in the casket. With shaking fingers, I zoomed in on my phone's flashlight, examining every visible detail. Her hands were folded peacefully, But now I noticed how her chest seemed oddly flat beneath her blue dress, how the funeral home's lighting created strange shadows around her collar. I grabbed more albums, Uncle Howard's funeral, Grandmother Rose's service, and spread them across our bed. In every photo, now that I knew what to look for, there were subtle signs. A slightly sunken area where tissue should have been, hands positioned to hide missing fingers, makeup applied heavier in certain spots. We'd been looking at crime scenes disguised as peaceful farewells, and none of us had known. The next morning, I couldn't open my hardware store. Instead, I drove to Riverside Memorial, which was already surrounded by news vans and police tape. I stood there watching investigators carry out more boxes from the basement, each one potentially containing pieces of someone's loved one. An older woman next to me was sobbing, clutching a photo of her husband who died 3 years earlier. She kept saying she'd specifically requested he be buried with his military medals, his father's watch, and his wedding ring, all items listed on Gerald's inventory sheets. Behind us, a young couple held each other, the woman pregnant and crying about her miscarried baby from 2 years ago. Gerald had kept a tiny hospital bracelet and what the detective delicately called tissue samples. The crowd grew throughout the morning, each person carrying their own horrible suspicion, their own photos to examine with new eyes, their own memories now tainted with violation. I recognized Bill Harmon, who owned the bakery downtown, standing apart from the crowd with his jaw clenched tight. His daughter Lisa had died in a car accident 5 years ago, just 23 years old. He told me Gerald had offered to do her makeup personally, said he wanted to make sure she looked perfect for her parents' final goodbye. Bill's fists kept opening and closing as he watched the evidence being removed, and I heard him whisper that he'd shaken Gerald's hand at the cemetery, thanked him for his kindness. The funeral director, a younger man named Paul who'd taken over Riverside Memorial just 2 years ago, stood on the front steps looking destroyed. He kept telling anyone who'd listen that he'd had no idea, that Gerald had been retired before he arrived, that all their records showed proper procedures were followed. But nobody wanted to hear his explanations. We were all too busy recalculating every interaction we'd had with Gerald, every sympathy card he'd sent, every gentle pat on the shoulder at our darkest moments. That afternoon, Jennifer and I met with other affected families at the community center. The room was packed with people I'd known my whole life, all of us now bound by this grotesque discovery. Margaret Phillips, who taught Sunday school, stood up and said her husband's body would need to be exhumed and examined. The prosecutor explained that Gerald had been charged with abuse of a corpse, theft and interference with burial rites, though his dementia meant he'd likely never stand trial. Someone asked about suing the funeral home, but the lawyer present said proving negligence would be difficult since Gerald had hidden his activities so well. The medical examiner spoke about the process of identifying and returning remains, warning us it could take months or even years to sort through everything. A woman in the back row suddenly screamed that she wanted Gerald to suffer, to know what he'd done, but his mind was already gone, leaving us with justice that could never truly be served. 3 weeks later, we received the call that my mother's remains had been identified and could be returned to us. Jennifer and I drove to the medical examiner's office in complete silence, the radio off, both of us staring at the wet February roads. They gave us a small wooden box containing what Gerald had taken, along with her wedding ring in a sealed evidence bag. The assistant medical examiner, a kind woman with tired eyes, explained that we could choose to have another burial ceremony, or have the remains cremated and added to her grave. She said many families were struggling with the same decision, that there was no right answer. I signed the paperwork with numb fingers, took the box that weighed almost nothing, and walked back to our car where I finally broke down completely. I sobbed like I hadn't since the day she actually died, but this was different. This was grief mixed with rage and a revulsion that made me want to scrub my own memories clean. We decided to have a private ceremony, just Jennifer, Kyle, and myself, on a cold Saturday morning. The funeral home, a different one 40 miles away, handled everything with careful respect, never asking questions about why we needed this second goodbye. As we stood at my mother's grave, placing the small box into a hole that shouldn't have needed to exist, Kyle read a poem my mother had loved about memory and peace. The cemetery was empty except for us and a groundskeeper in the distance, the March wind cutting through our coats. When we got home, I took every photo from the original funeral and locked them in a filing cabinet in the basement. I couldn't throw them away, but I couldn't look at them either. 6 months have passed now, and our town still carries this weight. Riverside Memorial closed permanently. The building stands empty, and nobody can drive past without remembering. Gerald died in the state facility last month, never understanding what he'd done, taking whatever twisted reasoning he'd had into oblivion. We're all trying to move forward, to remember our loved ones as they were in life, not as victims of a sick man's compulsion. But some violations can't be undone, they can only be endured, and that's the truth we're all learning to live with. Two weeks ago, I was driving through Kansas on my way to Colorado for a new construction job. I'm 24, been doing roofing work since I dropped out of community college, and honestly, I was excited about this opportunity. Better pay, chance to start fresh after a rough breakup. The drive should have taken me 2 days max, but my old Ford pickup had other plans when the radiator started overheating around 9 p.m. on a Tuesday night. I pulled into this rundown motel called the Desert Palm Inn, one of those places where the neon sign only has half the letters working and the paint is peeling off the walls. Figured I'd let the truck cool down overnight, get some sleep, and deal with it in the morning. The guy at the front desk, this skinny dude with a lazy eye and yellowed teeth, barely looked up from his phone when he handed me the key to room 18. I remember texting my sister Amanda that night, telling her about the delay and sending her a picture of the sad-looking motel. She joked that it looked like something out of a horror movie, and I laughed it off, told her I'd call her in the morning. After grabbing a burger from the vending machine, yeah, they had burgers in the vending machine, should have been my first red flag, I crashed hard on that lumpy mattress. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to someone knocking on my door. Not pounding or anything dramatic, just this steady, patient knocking. Knock, knock, knock. 3 times, then silence for about 30 seconds, then again. I figured maybe someone had the wrong room, so I called out asking who it was. The knocking stopped immediately. Through the peephole, I could see a man standing there, probably mid-40s, wearing a maintenance uniform. He had this perfectly normal face, clean-shaven, even had a name tag I couldn't quite read in the dim hallway light. When he saw the peephole darken, he smiled and held up a toolbox, said there was a leak in the room above mine and he needed to check my bathroom ceiling. Everything about the situation felt wrong. First off, what maintenance guy works at 2 a.m.? Second, the motel was only 1 story. I'd walked around the building earlier looking for the ice machine. But here's the thing about being exhausted and half asleep. Your brain doesn't always connect the dots right away. I told him through the door that he'd have to come back in the morning, that I was trying to sleep. He didn't argue, didn't insist, just nodded politely and walked away. I watched through the peephole as he went to the room next door, room 19, and used a key to go inside. That should have been my cue to pack up and leave, but I convinced myself he actually did work there if he had keys, right? I double-checked that my door was locked, pushed the little dresser in front of it for good measure, and tried to go back to sleep. But I kept hearing these sounds from next door, footsteps, drawers opening and closing, and what sounded like furniture being moved around. About an hour later, the sound stopped completely. The silence was almost worse than the noise. I was lying there, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of Texas, when I heard my doorknob slowly turning. Just this quiet, careful attempt to open the door. The dresser held it shut, but whoever was on the other side tried twice more before giving up. Then came the tapping on my window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see a shadow moving outside. The tapping turned into scratching, like someone running their keys along the glass. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but there was no signal. Not unusual for that stretch of highway, but the timing couldn't have been worse. The scratching stopped, and I heard footsteps moving away from my window. For maybe 5 minutes, nothing happened. Then I heard the maintenance guy's voice clear as day coming from right outside my door. "Sir, there's been a gas leak. You need to evacuate immediately." He sounded so professional, so genuinely concerned. I knew it was bullshit, but I also knew I was trapped. My truck was still messed up, no phone signal, and this guy clearly wasn't going away. I decided to try something stupid. I yelled back that I'd already called the police and they were on their way. Dead silence for about 10 seconds. Then he laughed this quiet little chuckle and said, "No, you didn't. There's no cell service here, but nice try, buddy." That's when real panic set in. He knew I couldn't call for help. I started getting dressed as quietly as possible, shoving my stuff into my backpack. The plan was to wait until I heard him move away from the door, then make a run for my truck, overheated engine or not. But while I was tying my boots, I heard something that made me stop cold. The sound of my truck starting up outside. Through a crack in the curtains, I watched him drive my pickup around to the back of the motel, out of sight from the main road. He must have hot-wired it while I was focused on the door and window. When he walked back past my window, he was carrying something from my truck, the tire iron I kept behind the seat. That's when things escalated fast. He wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. The door started shaking as he threw his weight against it. The cheap dresser was sliding with each hit. I grabbed the lamp from the nightstand, yanked the cord out of the wall, and held it like a baseball bat. On maybe the 5th or 6th hit, the door frame started splintering. I knew I had maybe seconds before he got through. There was this moment of absolute clarity where I realized I could either hide in the bathroom and get cornered, or I could try something desperate. I chose desperate. I grabbed the Bible from the nightstand drawer, every motel has one, and threw it through the window as hard as I could. Glass exploded everywhere and I screamed, "Fire! Fire!" at the top of my lungs, hoping someone, anyone, would hear. The hitting on the door stopped. Through the broken window I could hear dogs barking and a light turned on in the motel office. But then I heard him at the window, saw his hands gripping the frame trying to climb through despite the broken glass. I did the only thing I could think of. I swung that lamp right at his fingers. He cursed and pulled back, and I could see blood on the broken glass, but he wasn't giving up. He went back to the door, and this time I heard him using the tire iron as a pry bar. The wood was splitting, chunks falling onto the carpet. I kept screaming about the fire, begging for help, and finally, I heard someone yelling back. It was the lazy-eyed desk clerk, asking what the hell was going on. The man at my door immediately changed his tone, called out that he was maintenance, that I'd locked myself in, and was having some kind of breakdown. The desk clerk bought it for about 2 seconds until I screamed that he was trying to break in, that he'd stolen my truck. The clerk said he was calling the cops, and I heard him running back toward the office. The man outside my door went quiet. Through the hole he'd made in the door frame, I could see him standing there, just thinking. Then he looked right at me through that splintered wood and said very calmly, "You're going to wish you'd just opened the door." He disappeared from view, and I heard his footsteps heading toward the back of the motel. I thought maybe he was running, but then I smelled it. Gasoline. The bastard was pouring gasoline under my door. The liquid started seeping in, spreading across the ugly green carpet. I knew I had to get out right then. No more waiting for help. I grabbed my backpack, used it to clear the remaining glass from the window frame, and started climbing out. That's when he came around the corner, gas can in one hand, lighter in the other. We made eye contact for maybe 2 seconds, him with that maintenance uniform still on, blood dripping from his cut hand, me halfway out the window. He flicked the lighter, and I just threw myself out onto the concrete. I hit hard, felt something pop in my shoulder, but adrenaline got me up and running. Behind me, I heard the whoosh of flames and him cursing. I ran toward the main road, screaming for help, and that's when I saw them. 2 police cruisers pulling into the motel parking lot, lights flashing. The cops found him trying to squeeze through the bathroom window of room 19. Turns out he'd been staying there for 3 days under a fake name, paying cash. When they searched his room, they found duct tape, zip ties, a hunting knife, and a notebook. That notebook still haunts me. It had detailed notes about several guests, their routines, which rooms they were in, when they arrived, if they were alone. My entry said I was perfect because I was young, traveling alone, and had vehicle trouble. He'd been watching from his window when my radiator overheated, saw me struggling with it in the parking lot. The police told me later that they found evidence linking him to 2 other disappearances along that stretch of highway over the past year. Both were young men traveling alone. Both had vehicle trouble. They never found their bodies. The detective, this older woman with kind eyes but a hard voice, told me I was lucky. She said most people who get that knock at 2 a.m. don't get to tell their story. The maintenance uniform was stolen from the motel's laundry room, along with a master key card that the real maintenance guy hadn't even noticed was missing. What really messed with my head was finding out what he'd prepared in room 19. The police let me see the photos during the trial. I needed to know, needed to understand what I'd escaped. He'd covered the windows with aluminum foil and blankets. The bathroom had been lined with plastic sheets. There was a chair in the center of the room, bolted to the floor with metal brackets he'd installed himself. The duct tape on the armrests was already partially unrolled, ready to use. He had a video camera on a tripod pointed at that chair. In the closet, they found my wallet. He'd somehow gotten it from my truck when he moved it. But what really got me was the cooler full of ice he had in there, and the collection of small glass vials next to it. The prosecutor said he'd been buying veterinary sedatives online, the kind they use for large animals. He wasn't planning to kill me quickly. The detective said based on what they found, I would have been kept alive for days, maybe weeks. The trial lasted 6 months. I had to testify, had to sit in the same room as him while he wore a suit and tried to look normal. His name was Keith Dunbar, 46 years old, former veterinary assistant who'd lost his license 5 years ago for stealing drugs. He never showed any emotion during the trial, just sat there taking notes like he was studying us all. The only time I saw him react was when I described hitting his fingers with the lamp. He actually smiled at that, like he was remembering something pleasant. They gave him life without parole for the attempted kidnapping and assault, plus additional time for the 2 suspected murders once they found enough evidence. During the victim impact statement, I told the court about the nightmares, about how I can't stay in hotels anymore, how I check every lock 3 times before bed. But what I didn't tell them was that sometimes I wake up at 2 a.m. to phantom knocking, and I lie there paralyzed, listening to see if it's real or just my brain replaying that night. My shoulder still hurts when it rains. I tore something when I hit that concrete, and it never healed quite right. It's my reminder that I survived. I never made it to that job in Colorado. Couldn't handle the thought of driving alone through empty highways anymore. I moved back home, got a job with my uncle's roofing company, started seeing a therapist. My sister Amanda made me get one of those GPS trackers for my phone, and I check in with her every night. The Desert Palm Inn burned down 3 months after the incident, not from the gas he poured. They'd cleaned that up, but from an electrical fire that started in the office. Felt like the universe correcting itself somehow. I drove past that spot last month with my cousin, and there's just an empty lot now with some desert grass growing through the old foundation. Good riddance. People sometimes ask me if I believe in guardian angels or intuition or whatever, and I tell them I believe in that desk clerk with the lazy eye who actually called 911. And I believe in cheap motel dressers that can hold a door for just long enough. But mostly I believe in listening to that feeling in your gut that says something's wrong. That hesitation I felt at 2 a.m. when he knocked, that probably saved my life. Trust that feeling. Always. It was a Thursday afternoon in early March 2023, and I was working from home like I'd been doing for the past year at my tech support job. My wife Melissa had taken our 2 kids, Oliver who's 8 and Grace who's 6, to her mother's place for spring break, leaving me alone in our 2-story house in a quiet subdivision just outside of Indianapolis. The neighborhood was one of those newer developments where all the houses looked vaguely similar, beige and gray siding, two-car garages, young trees still held up by stakes. I'd been on back-to-back calls since 9 that morning, troubleshooting software issues for frustrated customers. My headset practically fused to my skull. The house felt too quiet without the kids running around, just the hum of my laptop fan and the occasional car passing by outside. Around 3:30, I was in the middle of walking someone through reinstalling their drivers when I heard this knocking. Not at my door, but somewhere close by, maybe the Johnsons' place next door. It wasn't normal knocking either. It was frantic, desperate, like someone pounding with both fists. Through my home office window, which faces the street, I could see this woman I'd never seen before going from house to house. She looked to be in her 40s, wearing what appeared to be pajama pants with cartoon cats on them, and a faded green sweatshirt that had dark stains down the front. Her hair was this distinctive reddish-orange color, but matted and tangled like she hadn't brushed it in days. She was barefoot despite the cold concrete, and the way she moved between houses was strange. Almost running, but with this jerky, uncoordinated gait like she kept forgetting how to use her legs properly. I muted my headset and watched her pound on the Johnsons' door for maybe 30 seconds before stumbling over to the Walker's house across the street. She wasn't just knocking, she was screaming something I couldn't quite make out through my closed window, her voice raw and cracking. When nobody answered at the Walkers, she actually tried the doorknob, rattling it violently before moving on. That's when I saw her face clearly for the first time as she turned toward my side of the street. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated so much they looked completely black, and there was this wetness around her mouth that caught the afternoon sun. She had these deep scratch marks down both cheeks, fresh ones that were still bleeding, and her lips were moving constantly even when she wasn't screaming, like she was having an argument with someone who wasn't there. The customer on my call was still talking about their computer problems, but I wasn't listening anymore. The woman had made it to the house 2 doors down from mine, the Nguyens' place, and she was throwing her whole body against their door now. I could hear the impacts even from inside my house, these heavy, meaty thuds that made me wince. Mrs. Nguyens' car was in the driveway, and I knew she worked nights at the hospital, so she was probably trying to sleep. After maybe a minute of this, the woman suddenly stopped and stood perfectly still, her head tilted at this unnatural angle, like she was listening to something. Then she reached into the pocket of her sweatshirt and pulled out what looked like a kitchen knife, one of those long carving knives with a black handle. The blade caught the light and I could see it wasn't clean. My first instinct was to call 911, but as I reached for my phone, I realized I could already hear sirens in the distance. Someone else must have called already. The woman heard them too, and her whole demeanor changed. She started making these low, guttural sounds that I could hear even through my window, almost like growling, and began walking directly toward my house. Not running, just this deliberate, purposeful stride while gripping that knife so tight her knuckles were white. I disconnected from my work call without saying anything and grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling as I tried to dial. She walked right past my front door though, didn't even glance at it, and went straight to my backyard gate. The gate that I knew I'd forgotten to lock after taking the trash out that morning. I heard the gate squeak open, and my heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Through my office window, I watched her disappear around the side of my house, and then I heard her at my back door, testing the handle. Thank God I'm paranoid about locking doors when I'm home alone. It was secured with both the knob lock and the deadbolt. But she didn't just try once and leave. She started slamming her shoulder into it over and over, and then I heard glass breaking. She'd punched through the small window next to the door. I could hear her trying to reach through to the locks, grunting with effort, the knife scraping against the door frame. I was already on with 911, the dispatcher asking me questions I could barely process, when I heard her give up on my door and move to the sliding glass door that led to the Brennan family's house. They shared a backyard fence line with me. The Brennans had 3 kids, and I knew Shannon was usually home during the day with their toddler, while the older 2 were at school. I ran upstairs to my bedroom window to get a better view of their backyard, still on the phone with dispatch, trying to explain what was happening. The woman was at their sliding door now, and I watched in horror as she used the knife handle to smash the glass. It took her 4 or 5 hits before it shattered completely, safety glass falling in chunks, and she reached through to unlock it. She disappeared inside, and I could hear Shannon screaming from across the yard, this piercing, terrified sound that made every hair on my arms stand up. The dispatcher was telling me units were 2 minutes out, to stay in my house, to keep my doors locked, but all I could think about was Shannon and her baby. Through the windows, I could see movement in the Brennan's house, shadows passing quickly behind curtains, and then Shannon appeared briefly in an upstairs window, holding her toddler, before ducking away. The woman must have seen her too, because I heard heavy footsteps on stairs, that distinctive creaking their old staircase made. Then there was this crash, like furniture being knocked over, and the baby started crying, that specific terrified infant wail that cuts right through you. I told the dispatcher the woman was now upstairs with the family, that they were trapped, and I could hear her typing frantically, updating the responding units. The sirens were getting louder, maybe a block away now, but it felt like they were taking forever. I could see 2 more neighbors had come out of their houses, standing in their driveways, phones pressed to their ears, everyone calling 911. The first police car came screaming around the corner, tires actually squealing like in movies, followed immediately by 2 more. Officers jumped out with their weapons drawn, and one of them was shouting into his radio for backup and paramedics. I watched 3 officers rush toward the Brennan's house while 2 others started evacuating the neighbors who were standing outside. One officer saw me in my window and made a sharp gesture for me to get back, to stay away from the windows. But I couldn't move. I was transfixed watching them enter through the same shattered sliding door the woman had used. Almost immediately I heard shouting from inside, multiple voices yelling commands, and then Shannon's voice again, high and panicked, saying something about a bathroom. The woman must have cornered them in there because all the noise seemed concentrated in one area of the house now. For maybe 3 minutes, there was this terrible standoff. I could hear the officers trying to talk to the woman, their voices firm but measured, trying to de-escalate. She was responding but not with words, just these animalistic shrieks that didn't sound entirely human. Then there was this loud bang, like someone had kicked in a door, followed by a struggle. Furniture crashing, glass breaking, everyone yelling at once. The baby's crying got louder and more frantic, and I heard one officer radioing for immediate medical assistance. 2 more police cars had arrived by then, officers setting up a perimeter around the house, keeping gathering neighbors back. One officer was unrolling yellow tape, already sectioning off the Brennan's property, while another was going door to door, checking on residents, making sure everyone was accounted for. Then suddenly, everything went quiet except for the baby crying. No more struggling, no more shrieking, just officers talking in those low, professional tones they use when a situation is under control. About a minute later, I saw them bringing the woman out through the front door. She was in handcuffs, 2 officers holding her arms, and her head was hanging down, hair covering her face. Her sweatshirt was torn, and there was blood on her hands and bare feet. She wasn't fighting anymore. She looked almost catatonic, like all the wild energy had just drained out of her. They put her in the back of a patrol car, and I noticed one of the officers was limping, holding his arm against his ribs. An ambulance had pulled up, and paramedics rushed inside with their equipment. A few minutes later, they brought Shannon out holding her baby, both of them crying but seemingly uninjured. She looked shell-shocked, her face pale, clutching her child like she was afraid to let go. The aftermath was surreal. Police were everywhere, taking photos, collecting evidence, interviewing everyone who had seen anything. A detective came to my house about an hour later, took my statement, asked me about the timeline, what I'd observed. He told me the woman was being taken for psychiatric evaluation, that she'd been reported missing from a facility in the next county 2 days earlier after stopping her medication. The knife, he said, had been taken from a house 3 streets over where she'd broken in that morning while the owners were at work. They'd found the place ransacked, food eaten straight from the fridge, medication bottles emptied on the counter. Shannon and her baby were physically okay, just traumatized. The officer who'd been injured had bruised ribs from where the woman had fought him, but nothing serious. The detective said we'd all been lucky. These situations could go much worse. As I watched them finishing up, the yellow tape fluttering in the evening breeze, I kept thinking about those few minutes when she was at my back door, when that knife was scraping against my door frame, and how different this story could have ended. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood where most people minded their own business, but kept an eye out if something strange was going on. Back then, I was working long shifts at a local auto shop, so most evenings I just wanted peace and quiet when I got home. Around that period, the talk among neighbors was that one side of our street had a duplex that had been abandoned for years. The paint was peeling, the windows were grimy, and weeds pushed through cracks in the driveway. It looked like the kind of place kids dared each other to run past at night. Still, it was supposed to be empty, so when the late-night banging and muffled voices started, people didn't just gossip, they called the cops. When the police pulled up one night, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped outside, joining a few neighbors who were already gathered near the sidewalk. The red and blue lights washed over the cracked siding of the duplex, making it look even more menacing. Officers moved quickly, shining flashlights through the broken front door. You could tell by their posture that they weren't treating it like a prank call. The front door frame looked splintered, like someone had kicked it in not too long ago. That was the first time it clicked for me that the sounds we'd been hearing weren't just echoes from inside a decaying house. Someone was actually in there. I remember the silence as the officers disappeared into the duplex. The neighborhood, which normally buzzed with TVs and porch conversations at that hour, felt drained of sound. Everyone stood still, waiting, staring at that ugly house. After a few tense minutes, one officer came back out and spoke quietly into his radio. Then two more went in, carrying tools I couldn't make out. The whole time I kept wondering what could possibly be inside that place. Rats, maybe a group of teenagers messing around, or something worse. My chest tightened with this weird sense of dread, like we were about to learn something we'd all regret knowing. The wait stretched on until suddenly we heard a sharp thud from inside, followed by muffled voices. It wasn't the officers. It sounded more like someone had shifted furniture or knocked something heavy over. One of the cops yelled out, and a few seconds later there was a commotion, boots stomping against wood. The next thing we saw, two officers were dragging out what looked like a section of rotted wall paneling. They dropped it on the porch, and behind it was a narrow, pitch-black crawl space. Out of that space, the police pulled out 3 people, one by one. They weren't teenagers, they were adults, filthy, thin, and glaring at us like cornered animals. The sight of them chilled everyone watching. Their clothes were filthy, layered like they hadn't been changed in weeks, and their faces were streaked with dirt. One of the men had a greasy cap pulled so low you could barely see his eyes, but you could feel his stare sweeping over the crowd. The woman with them had matted hair that looked almost gray under the streetlights, though she couldn't have been older than 40. She didn't fight or yell. She just stared down, whispering something too quiet to catch. The officers kept tight grips on them while calling for backup, and I'll never forget how unnatural it felt, seeing people pulled out of a wall like that. When more police arrived, they started moving us back toward our houses. I remember one of my neighbors, Mr. Callahan, muttering, "I knew it wasn't rats." He wasn't joking, he sounded angry, almost vindicated. Later, one of the officers explained to a few of us that the group had been hiding in that crawl space for weeks, maybe longer. They'd carved out sections of the duplex, making narrow passages you'd never notice unless you were looking for them. The cops said they found sleeping bags, food wrappers, even a small notebook full of addresses. That detail sent a ripple through everyone, because those addresses weren't random. They belonged to people living right there on our street. It didn't take long to realize what that meant. They had been watching us, tracking our routines, marking down who left for work early, who stayed out late, whose porch light never came on. The idea that strangers had been sitting in that rotting house, spying through cracks or slipping out at night to peek into windows, made my skin crawl in a way I can't even explain. Suddenly, all those times I thought I heard footsteps on the sidewalk or felt like curtains had shifted when no one was there didn't feel so harmless anymore. The duplex wasn't just a nuisance. It had been a base for people planning to break into our homes. I barely slept that night. Every sound carried a new weight. The creak of my fence, the rattle of branches against the siding, even my own fridge humming felt too loud. When I did drift off, I kept picturing that crawl space, the way they had to crouch and squeeze into the darkness. I imagined them slipping out after midnight, moving silently between houses while we slept just a few feet away. The worst part was realizing that if the neighbors hadn't called about the noise, we might never have found out. They could have chosen any of us next. The following morning, a cleanup crew was already at the duplex, hauling out trash bags full of things the squatters had left behind. I walked past on my way to grab coffee, and I swear the smell hit me before I even reached the corner. It was sour, rotten, like spoiled food mixed with mildew. Through the open doorway, I caught a glimpse of the crawl space again, just a jagged rectangle in the wall leading into shadows. It didn't look big enough for anyone to live in, yet they had. That thought alone stuck with me the entire day. Later, one of the officers stopped by our street again. He told a few of us that the squatters had been linked to a string of small burglaries in the area, stolen electronics, tools, and even a couple of cars broken into. They hadn't been caught before because they never stayed in one place too long. Using the duplex gave them cover, and apparently they were bold enough to sneak out and wander right under our noses. I remember standing there, nodding, but inside I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though the crawl space was now empty. That evening I sat on my porch with the lights on, listening harder than I ever had before. Every flicker of movement, a cat darting across the street, a branch scraping the window, set me on edge. The idea that people had been studying us like prey made me rethink how safe our neighborhood really was. I double-checked my locks, closed every curtain, and for the first time considered installing cameras around my house. Some of my neighbors admitted they were doing the same. It wasn't just paranoia. It was the reality of knowing our privacy had been shattered. Eventually, life returned to something close to normal, though none of us looked at that duplex the same way again. A few months later, it was boarded up completely, and the city talked about tearing it down. Still, even after it was sealed, I couldn't walk past without imagining those figures crouched in the dark, waiting, listening. It's been years now, but I still keep my porch light on every night. Not for me, really, but as a reminder that sometimes the walls hiding in plain sight can hold things you'd rather never discover.